sick to the teeth of the news on the screen, of a Hezbollah scum and jihad, the obscene, whose men plant the bombs and then live feeling free to watch women and children be killed on TV. Which Satan delivers a child of death curse in the name of a worn-out collection of verse. I've not read the book, so I cannot recite, but I bet Salman Rushdie is just about right. Underneath the black cloud of Islam.
Gary Gannon now, please.
The Social Democrats will be supporting, and we're proud to co-sign the motion as presented by Sinn Féin and a number of different charities and NGOs working in the field. I imagine there is no silence as deafening as that invoked by a ceasefire. What happens, what sound does a person hear when bombs stop being dropped, when screams are not being heard for the first time in weeks, when fighter jets are not screeching overhead, threatening the lives of people and children in a population, one of the most congested population on earth? It was interesting to look at the newspapers today. For the first time in over 2 weeks, there wasn't mention on the front pages of the conflict in Gaza that claimed so many lives only last week. During the horrors of the latest round of violence to be inflicted on the Palestinian people, the Irish people stood in shocked disbelief that one group of people could treat another with such barbarism, with such inhumanity. We were horrified by the death toll. As of today, 248 people in Gaza were killed from precision missiles, 66 of those killed being children. Almost 2,000 people wounded in one of the most congested places on earth. One can't help but imagine the carnage that was rained on the people of Gaza from the sky from million-pound missiles. Images of the last 2 weeks will live long in all of our memories. Buildings being reduced to rubble in which bodies were then pulled from. Trying to make sense of the death toll, of the number of children being killed, of entire families being clearly targeted, 3 and 4 generations in some instances of Palestinians being quite clearly being lined up for extermination by Israeli defence forces who weren't only targeting the fighters, they were targeting their children and their parents too in many cases. Trying to make sense of how a country which presents itself as a modern democracy could destroy a building that contains a news outlet and journalists tasked with reporting on the conflict. Trying to make sense of how Israel could continue to expel families from their homes and meet the protest of those families and their communities with rubber bullets when they protested. Trying to make sense of how a modern democracy could storm a place of worship during the holiest period in that faith of those people praying there and not see that as anything other than a provocation. Battens to rubber bullets, to skunk water, to precision missiles for the audacity of imposing forced expulsions, for confronting the storming of their holiest sites. 248 dead, 66 children, a population of over 2 million terrorised, and today the attention of the world seemingly has moved on. Another authoritarian regime attacked the free press this week, and the world can clearly only see one despot at a time. The tyrant in Belarus, of which I speak of, sent an F-16 fighter jet to effectively force a Ryanair plane to perform a rendition flight so that a young journalist could be kidnapped in an egregious act of state piracy of the skies of Belarus. The response yesterday from the EU Council was swift, it was prompt and it was just, but one could not help but witness in a contrast that bordered on hypocrisy given the meekness of the international response to the savagery of the Israeli government towards the people of Gaza over the last number of weeks, of months, of years, of decades. Lukashenko hijacked the plane and kidnapped the journalists. A grotesque act that has been met with sanctions, been met with international boycotts of Belarusian airspace and a unified condemnation by world leaders. The fighter jets of Benjamin Netanyahu bombed the bureaus of Al Jazeera and the Associated Press just last week, and the only collective response the world could agree upon was a meek call for calmness of hostilities on both sides. For this crime, there will be no sanctions, there will be no boycotts or divestments that target the pockets of the perpetrators of this crime. And the world seems to have moved on very quickly. Moved on from the scenes of destruction and the scenes of death we witnessed being inflicted upon the people and children of Gaza just last week. Today, though, through our Parliament, the Irish people get to take a stand, to give words and to give meaning of what our own eyes can clearly see. It will be significant that the Irish Parliament, through its representatives, recognises what Israel is doing in East Jerusalem and West Bank represents a de facto unlawful annexation of these territories. It is important that we do this now and to not equivocate as we do so, but to be unified in their message that Israeli actions would no longer go unchallenged, if not by the international community, then certainly by the people of Ireland, who remain in horror at the barbarism we witnessed. While the world seems to turn its attention elsewhere, the people of Gaza remain under effective siege. The bulldozers are still moving into East Jerusalem, where opposition to their presence is crushed, and families in Sheikh Jarrah are still being forced from their homes. So we, as a truly modern, vibrant democracy, recognising that an annexation is being carried out by the State of Israel and the Palestinian territories, is an important act that will reverberate around the world and hopefully have some meaning for the people who are being displaced from their land. And I hope that we continue to speak truth to power in this manner and go further in their condemnation of the Israeli state and its government for their actions in this regard. Last week I spoke in this chamber of that when diplomacy fails, when children are being blown up in their beds. It should never be forgotten that all our hopes are for a peaceful two-state solution to this decades-long crisis, but it is naive in the extreme to think that a right-wing hawks in the Israeli government are interested in such an endeavour when they continue their occupations, continue their illegal expansions into Palestinian territory, and continue to inflict persecution and a form of apartheid on the Palestinian peoples in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. I once again want to call for the Irish government and the Irish state to not be temperate in their language or in their condemnation, and to speak truth in whatever form it comes. I welcome the fact that across the chamber we will agree that a form of annexation is taking place. That will be important. I put great thought into the government's amendment, but I won't be supporting it on the grounds that it equates a form of both-sidism. Of course we condemn Hamas for firing rockets into Israeli territory. Of course we acknowledge that 12 Israelis have died in this conflict and condemn it in all of its forms. But to not see the disproportionality in the response from the Israeli government would be to be meek, to create a false equivalence, and to give the false impression that both sides are equal in this endeavour, when one has access to Iron-Dome military defences, $1 billion in terms of their armories, is funded by the US amongst other, and the other is a population, one of the poorest, most congested parts of the world, who are being bombed and targeted. I once again want to refer to what's happening in Gaza as a form of state-sponsored terrorism. Human Rights Watch last week, 2 weeks ago now, referred to the situation occurring in the East Bank and Jerusalem as a form of apartheid. I think we have to remember that. I think we have to acknowledge it, and I think we have to be deliberate in our responses there. Minister, I welcome the position that you're going to take today. I think it's brave. I think it's one that will reverberate. But I think the Irish government has to go further. We simply have to. I think now is the time to enact the Occupied Territories Bill. We simply can't accept now that an annexation is happening, but say that business will continue as usual, because it can't. We can't trade in an area of the world where we now recognise that an annexation is taking place in. I think it's been a point being well made, but we can't call for a two-state solution and continue to not recognise Palestine as a state in its own right. I'd go further than that and call for a full Irish ambassador to be placed in Ramallah. I think this will be a very significant step to take, an important step to take. And last week I took the decision to sponsor a bill, a petition that was placed by People for Profit to expel the Israeli ambassador. This was not a decision I take lightly, but it's one that I do stand over, and it's one I'd like to speak to just in the last minute that I have. I believe that Israel is an apartheid state engaged in a brutal assault of Gaza, the most densely packed internment camp in the world. More than 230 people, more than 266 people were killed in the bombardment, many of them children. Of the 66 who have died, children who died, 11 were participating in a Norwegian Refugee Council programme that provides support to children in Gaza to help them deal with trauma. These innocents, who were already emotionally and physically scarred from previous violence, died under Israeli missiles. Many died under burn and rubble with their entire extended families. The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, said, "If there is an hell on earth, it is the lives of the children of Gaza." Strong words, but where was the action against Israel for inflicting this hell on those children? The response of the international community to the carnage in Gaza has been shameful and it has been craven. The UN Security Council could not even agree to release a statement calling for a ceasefire. Minister Coveney has said that expelling the Israeli ambassador would not be helpful. I would strongly argue that neither would words nor platitudes be helpful. Prior to this latest assault, Israel had been engaged in the forced eviction of Palestinian families as it continues to expand its illegal settlements. There comes a time when inaction in the face of relentless human rights abuses and war crimes becomes complicity. Most importantly, this will send a message to the people of Gaza. We support you. We are with you.
Can I begin by commending the Sinn Féin party for tabling this motion and providing the time for this House to debate one of the most for some time with the support of a number of external groups. The focus of the motion over the last number of weeks was on the systematic undermining, if not the shattering, of the basis of a two-state solution to the generations of conflict and violence between Israel and Palestine, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We in Ireland know full well that peace can only be brought about when an acceptable situation is negotiated and embraced and agreed for both parties involved. Lasting, sustainable peace cannot be achieved through repression or through force of arms. You might suppress matters for a period of time, but ultimately there is no lasting, sustainable peace and no comfort for anybody involved. The long-sought goal of two separate and sovereign states with equal rights for all, a true and permanent home for all Israelis and for all Palestinians, each with the inalienable entitlement to live in peace without threat or intimidation. Each state and each people being able to develop to their fullest potential without let or hindrance according to its capacity and likes. Surely that is the hope and the legitimate expectation of every Palestinian, and too of every Israeli. The achievable prospect of that vision, long sought by the international community, has been systematically undermined by an Israeli government intent on eliminating a viable Palestinian state through forced evictions and the supplanting of population. Through deliberate, calculated, brutal action, the Israeli government has sought to undermine the agreed international objective of the creation of two peaceful states side by side. The policy of the Netanyahu government, supported forcibly by the former US President Trump, was to act in defiance of international law, in fact, to break international law with impunity. The situation, Ceann Comhairle, became immeasurably more urgent with the escalation of violence in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories of recent weeks. We looked on with horror yet again as civilians were killed, including women, and as far as we can count, at least 65 children. The pictures that we have all witnessed of innocent children at play in their own homes, in their own streets, being killed, being maimed, is just unacceptable and shocking. And the notion that every effort is being made to avoid civilian casualties, is belied by the reality on the ground and the horror that has been witnessed by everybody in the world. Last week in this House, I said a ceasefire would come when Israel decided that it had destroyed all it wanted to destroy. That happened, thankfully, on Friday. That was predictable. But we can't now simply let our focus be removed from the ongoing, festering wound in world affairs that is the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Periodic condemnation is simply not enough. I welcome the words spoken by the Minister for Foreign Affairs today. I genuinely believe that he has worked extraordinarily hard, not only in the last number of weeks, but since he took office, to build consensus at the United Nations and at EU level. But as has become patently clear, it is virtually impossible to get consensus at the Security Council because America will veto a strong and coherent statement. 2 weeks to provide a press statement is shocking and undermines the principles that led to the establishment of the United Nations in the first instance. And countries such as Hungary and others at the EU Council prevent a common position emerging there too. Last week, Ceann Comhairle, I also cited the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund decision to drop funding of companies involved in the development of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. We need now, if we can't bring others with us, to be the vanguard of action ourselves. The root cause of conflict needs to be addressed. Not only the symptoms which inevitably bubble up periodically as the repression of an entire people who have been corralled into an area, who are not allowed to fish in their own territorial seas, young Palestinians who have never visited or set foot in Jerusalem, their own aspiring capital. Philip Lazzarini, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the Relief and Works Agency of the United Nations, said on Sunday, the root causes of the conflict, the occupation, the displacement, of which we've had a strong reminder in East Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah, the blockage and the cycle of violence. This sense of normality will only be a mirage until the next conflict. So let us now resolve in this House, if need be, to act ourselves on this moral imperative for all of us, where I believe genuinely the Irish people are united. Not to accept the mirage of normality, to borrow the words of UNRWA's Secretary General. We know that that mirage is not the reality. That mirage is not the truth. And if we are to allow the notion and objective, the legitimate expectation of the Palestinian people to have their own state, to live in peace, as well as the legitimate, reasonable and proper expectation of the people of Israel to have their own state without fear of intimidation or threat, if we believe that that is not only a desirable goal, but an achievable goal, let us take whatever actions we now need to take, even if they are ineffective because we are a small country acting alone, to ensure that our absolute rejection of the undermining of a two-state solution and the annexation of Palestinian land, the forced eviction by force of arms of the Palestinian people and settlers, some of whom have been promised that land since they were first uprooted from their original homeland in the 1940s. Let us act together in consort with determination and with a unified voice in this House tomorrow.
And what kind of publicity needs so much blood? It's not for some sad diabolical god, selling himself as a two-bit Macbeth, as the expert in sentencing cousins to death. And what kind of God can this be anyway, that you gotta prostrate to him 5 times a day, with hate in your heart and a gun in your hand? Is force the only thing to understand? Underneath the black cloud of Islam,